everyone, and welcome to Hangfire. I'm so happy to be speaking to my guest today, Dr. Allison Bumsted, a professor and author of the book TeenSet, Teen Fan Magazines, and Rock Journalism. Don't let the name fool you. Today, we're going to be going back in time to visit the world of teen magazines in the early 60s and their huge influence on the Stones and their fans. Allison, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Justin. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Absolutely. I'm excited to have this chat. I think a lot of people are going to be interested in this subject and maybe for the first time introduced to the world of teen magazines, music teen magazines, and specifically TeenSet. So to get into that, I'd love to know what drew you to this topic. What pulled you into TeenSet and the world of teen magazines?
Well, I was a fan magazine reader in the 90s. I'll age myself. There were some specific bands and heartthrobs and five spicy girls that I like to read about.
Sure.
And anyways, so I knew I loved them. I left them behind, in my teen years. But when I was working on my doctoral thesis, I was further writing about something I've worked on, which is how Paul McCartney was received by the press in the 70s, specifically with Wings. And I looked a lot at genre theory and how people would talk about pop versus rock and where Paul fit in and why exactly, whether it was musically or not. And so I was extending it to talk about all four Beatles. And while in that world, I came across a master's thesis by Rolling Stone editor Chet Flippo before he was an editor in the 70s. And he mentions in his history of rock and roll and Rolling Stone and rock journalism, TeenSet and Judy Sims. And I was really stopped in my track because I thought, I know 16, I know Tiger Beat, I know all of these magazines. I don't know this one. Why don't I know this one? And then it just shattered a lot of glass. Really thought about where women fell in the story, in the narrative. And so I bought a few and I just went down a rabbit hole and, found an area where magazines had been dismissed because they weren't seen as serious to rock journalism, or they weren't the, Rolling Stone magazine or Cream, or as some claim Crawdaddy, which only so many could have read that in 66. Anyways, and it just shattered my glass, and I ran with it.
I want to mention this quote that's in your book by the great Van Dyke Parks that starts it off with saying that TeenSet effectively was the precursor to Rolling Stone magazine, which we'll get into in this chat. But maybe you can give us a little brief snapshot as to the landscape of teen magazines when TeenSet was coming out.
Sure, absolutely. Teen fan magazines. There's a difference between teen, like lifestyle magazines, 17 teen, and teen fan magazines. The big difference is a teen fan magazine like 16 or Tiger Beat or multiple others, Teen Life, TeenSet, Teen Screen, Teen Beat. They focused on the celebration, the pure love of all things popular culture with a very heavy focus on music. And so it made them the first of their kind, really rooted in the Hollywood fan magazines of the 50s, but really just very different as musicians, especially in the early to mid 60s, would have been a little bit more accessible. But in 55, we have like Dig, 57, 16, which many listeners may know of or have heard of or read themselves. Date Book in the late 50s. And then throughout the 60s, we see 15, we see Teen Life, we see TeenSet, and then Tiger Beat and Teen Beat, Teen Scoop. Teen Screens existed since the early 60s as well. So there are quite a few magazines and many one-shot magazines, as they would call them, where it was just a focus. As we'll look at, there were a few Rolling Stone ones, many Beatles ones, and other stars as well.
TeenSet in particular really had an overview of various topics, not just music, but also social topics and kind of current events, and tied a lot of that together, which is what Van Dyke Parks is talking about in that quote where TeenSet was a precursor, because that's what Rolling Stone really became in it. They were known for encompassing this wide net. And we have a lot to thank for Miss Judith Sims to really pull that together, right?
Absolutely. Judy is a really interesting figure in, print media history, popular music history, rock history. She did a lot of amazing things and has been left out of the story until more recently, of course. And when she started writing, Capitol Records had owned TeenSet. It was a promotional piece, as you know, with the Beach Boys right here.
Nice.
In fall of '64, this is volume 1. It's all Beach Boys, and it is a absolutely beautiful issue if you want to collect it. But this would have been run by Brown Meggs, all Capitol execs like Fred Rice, and they came out with a second edition, which focused on Peter Gordon, Bobby Rydell, Donna Loren, and Beatles as well, anything that was Capitol Records. After these two issues and the success of the TeenSet, you can actually join the TeenSet. There's an advertisement where you can actually join the TeenSet for $1, get Capitol promotional materials. And after the success of this and around 20,000 members, they decided to turn this into a full-fledged teen magazine where they just wash their hands and let it go. And they turned it over to Lou Kimsey. Any Hot Rod fans may know his name. And he had a secretary at his corporation, the Chemtex Corporation, who loved music, was at the Strip all the time in Hollywood, had a background working with her college paper and in English, and loved music. And he gave her the editorial reins of this teen fan magazine, which is quite special because you have to be the right person, right place, and right time just to say, oh, you don't have any experience editing a magazine. Here you go. Go for it.
That's really amazing. And then the rest is history. We know rock journalism to be from a period of, you know, the 60s and late 60s and 70s, but here with TeenSet coming into fruition 64, 65, it's really blossoming in this field. What was rock journalism really back during these early pre-days?
Well, if you wanted to read about rock and roll, you really did need to read the teen fan magazines or maybe any random one-shots that would have that information, general papers, if they felt like it was worthy of covering. Music was often written about in a little bit more lofty stance, which would have been in Downbeat. Downbeat was the jazz magazines. There's a great book by Matt Brennan called When Genres Collide, when talks about Downbeat and Rolling Stone specifically, if anyone's interested in further exploring that. But you have your jazz critics, jazz criticism, all of that. And rock and roll does show up in Downbeat. Sometimes it's positive, but the majority of it, which I think it's Buddy Rich in Downbeat who said it was for idiots by idiots, right? As much as we love Buddy Rich.
A great drummer, great speaker, always had his foot in his mouth.
Yeah, exactly. And but you have the greats like Ralph J. Gleason, who there's a fantastic book out on him right now by Don Armstrong, who also is a big fan of TeenSet. Ralph J. Gleason, Nat Hentoff, Leroy Jones, Leonard Feather, all of these jazz critics that really embody what we think of when we think of a more modern music critic, at least at that time period, into rock and roll. Well, rock and roll didn't have its own designated space. And that's where the teen fan magazines really filled the space. You see a lot of rock writers actually write for the teen fan magazines, especially in the late 60s as rock writing is gaining. But if you wanted to read about Rolling Stones, you needed to, unless it was in the local newspaper, and however that would be presented, you needed to turn here. Beatles, you needed to turn here. So these magazines really do fill the space. Now, rock journalism, you can start reading. Some would say Berkeley Barb in '65. You start to see it in some of these cool papers. KLRA Beat will have some starting, I believe, '65 as well on. And then the one that they give the most credit to would be Crawdaddy magazine. Paul Williams' Crawdaddy is the one that they say is the beginning of rock journalism, really first printed. But it was mimeographed in, you know, a dorm room and stapled together. So if you look at the early years of it, it's all white, and there are copies floating around if you can find them on the internet, sometimes to download. And John Landau wrote for them, and for Paul Williams. And then Rolling Stone becomes the big one, right? It's right place, right time, help of a jazz writer like Ralph J. Gleason and whatnot. And then we start to see Cream, and then many others come that direction.
I'm so glad you mentioned Downbeat. In fact, I learned of all that in your book because Downbeat, I guess, predates all the rock journalism magazines.
30s.
Oh, wow. The
1930s.
That's amazing.
Yeah. What we think of when like the real critical stuff comes in the 50s in Downbeat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes total sense, right? Because I mean, there's nothing more cerebral and deep thinking than jazz,
Yeah, exactly.
especially as it goes into the 50s and it leaves the big band era and all that stuff, and it gets more heady.
Mhm.
So for there to be a slew of critics and writers for it makes total sense, and then that eventually bled into the rock world, the rock and roll world. I mean, that's fascinating. Most people probably would make that connection.
No, and it's definitely the marginalization of rock and roll that helps with the attitude. But what I argue in the book is that the rock writers become the same with the same attitude as the jazz writers when it comes to pop. A few other magazines that people might, if they're really into this stuff, might be saying, "Why aren't you mentioning Hit Parader or Melody Maker?" Well, those magazines were very good too. You could read those and find musical stuff, but it would be more in the sense of reprinting of lyrics, and it wasn't quite what it becomes. Both of those magazines, Hit Parader really becomes cool in the 70s. Same with Melody Maker, but it wasn't quite the same as the teen mags or what we think of with the rock press.
TeenSet had it was one of many magazines that were writing about the Stones. How are the Stones usually portrayed throughout all these different publications?
There are so many various articles throughout the magazines, but in general, I imagine people have some ideas. Just what were your ideas before you read some of the pieces?
Well, I figured that people would be obsessed with the looks, the image, the
Hmm.
persona, because they were a little bit rough around the edges and not as slick as others. So I figured that they'd be so honed in on just who are these monsters? Who are these creatures?
And you are absolutely right. We start to see the Stones pop up in the magazines in 64. And that is even in their own fan club magazine, which I will hold up for you to see. In 1964, this thing just fell. We have a Rolling Stones fan magazine. That's what we'd call a one shot or a one off, where there weren't continuations of this, but we have a few, and this is one of them. And of course, on the back, instantly, it says, "Scruffy, shaggy, scraggly hair. Absolutely. Man, we're not rebels. We just like it that way."
Yeah, man.
And this one's fallen apart a bit, but
Yeah, as
yeah,
an
so
autograph nerd, I would have loved the back cover too because it had the
yeah, it
signatures
has
in
the
the back. That's
signatures. Yeah,
beautiful.
absolutely. And so you could hang this on your wall. A lot of people would think that you would easily be able to obtain some of these magazines, but because of what you said, this one's broken, but this would have been torn off and hung on the wall. So these
Sure.
magazines or cut up and put in a scrapbook. So they are harder to come across, especially this one. Uh, there is one on eBay, so if anyone wants to grab it
Mm. You
before
like
I grab another one. Um, Anyways, but yeah, absolutely. You see that instantly, but we know there are people working in their background that help give them this image. And I don't think it's any surprise that someone like Andrew Oldham would be a big part and play in that image. But it is throughout um, throughout the magazines. Actually, I have one piece where uh, I will give you this. It's not just the physical look, but it's the bad boy thing. Would you let your daughter marry Rolling Stone?
classic.
And in Tiger Beat, let's see, in Tiger Beat in 67, or 65, sorry. This is the very second issue of Tiger Beat. And it's such a great one. It's Who's the Boss? The Birds or the Stones? You get to decide, of course. It doesn't tell you what to think. But it's such a beautiful issue. And inside, it's actually quite a great article on the Stones. And they even talk about how even the Beatles list the Stones as they're high on their list of favorites. But they mention Keith and Brian specifically. All of them have profiles on the Stones. That's one thing that you can't miss is there's just like the Beatles, there are profiles on the Stones. Not to the extent, like I said, the Stones aren't considered as much, but that's partly in their own doing and not giving the interviews. But this article from this one says Keith Richard and Brian Jones both had to leave school because of truancy and troublemaking problems. Like, these boys used to be billed in London as boys whose fathers wouldn't want their daughters to date. Now with success, both Keith and Brian have mellowed, and with money jangling in their pockets, there are probably a great many fathers who would want their daughters to date the boys. Yeah, I mean, it's great, right? And it's like, so far, Keith and Brian have avoided marriage, but it could happen anytime. Being married hasn't hurt the popularity of either Bill Wyman or Charlie Watts. So if Keith or Brian met the right girl, things may happen.
I want to highlight what you mentioned there is that, the way the Stones were being portrayed versus, let's say, the Beatles had a lot to do with just how much access the press and these magazines had to their subjects. And the Stones were not as generous, let's say, as others.
No, actually, I want to highlight that specifically because Teen Screen calls Brian Jones out openly in kind of a real pointed, in-your-face letter to let you know that they are not happy with the Stones when they love the Stones. One of the things that's really important in these magazines is that they love the Stones. They don't want to hurt the Stones. They don't ever want to hurt the Beatles, even if one specific, if anyone can think of Datebook, hurts the Beatles, not on purpose. They don't ever want to hurt them. And I want to share with you, have it here, the specific article that has a call out of the Stones in it that I think is something that is just beyond belief, kind of like how it calls it out. So in Teen Screen, in a specific issue, Janie Milstead actually calls out, and Janie Milstead is another awesome female editor whose name is not often spoken, and I knew reading it without even looking at it who it was because of what she was saying, but she called out Brian specifically, and she wrote Rolling Stone wrong about Teen Screen. Stones don't typically, they don't like to talk to the press, especially at this time. And when the press was going off, she said, I wasn't asking any questions. And she said, during the heat of the battle, someone asked a rather personal question. You, as in Brian, turned your head aside in disgust and muttered, Teen Screen, scream teen. And she was not happy. And she said, if there had been room to fall off my chair, I would have, because it was so obvious what the remark implied, that another in a long line of distorted invasions of privacy would probably appear in print somewhere as a result of that personal question. And so she recognized that it was an issue, but she didn't ask it. And she was like, we don't ask those questions. We don't do that. And she criticizes them for that. She's like, we love you. We want to include your voice. And at the very end, she's like, I'll still be in the front row at your shows, but she's like, you probably won't remember me after 3 times of meeting me. She was not happy. And I love that it's its own piece in the magazine. But to be fair, to write about the Rolling Stones, you had to have some kind of angle because they weren't giving the interviews to the magazines, which is a shame because they loved them. The fans loved them and they wanted to read about them.
Seemed like it was a win-win on their part, right? Because they don't give the interviews, they can continue this facade that the Stones company have created here. So it seemed like it was perfect for everyone involved. They had the press had something to write about. The Stones had nothing to read about themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Especially during these early days of their fame and rise to fame. So you see that early on. One thing I think both you and I were talking about, and this research, this isn't published quite yet. It's still ongoing. I'm still going through the magazines for anyone who's listening. There are so many things and so many various magazines, and every day I open up one that I've had or have through hundreds of them, and I find something that supports what I'm looking at. And one of the things I've noticed is everybody loves Mick Jagger right away, not Brian. And I think you and I both thought maybe Brian would be a bit more of a darling in the magazines, but he's not. And I think this article from Janie is why.
Mm-hmm.
If you make the editors and everyone else feel like what they do for a living doesn't matter, they're not covering as much.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't as nice
Mm-hmm.
in that sense. And now I know there's a lot of Brian fans out there. I'm not insulting Brian. I'm not criticizing Brian. But that is part of it. I know the other, other lads in the same case, but they weren't. I mean, Charlie was seen as nice and quiet, and so was Brian. Bill wasn't really talked about. Not really. He just kind of was there. But Mick and Keith, Mick and Keith, Mick and Keith, Mick and Keith. They love Mick. Actually, I'll show you. This is a May 66 Tiger Beat. I love this cover. It's quite rare to have a cover of dedicated to Stones for the teen fan magazines, because again, they didn't give many interviews. So this one is excellent. It's really, really beautiful, and it has John Lennon on it too, which makes it awesome as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very sexual too. Look at Jagger's hand.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know.
Easy there.
Exactly. I was thinking of Al Bundy instantly. I thought, whoa.
Busting his trousers in that shot.
I know, exactly. So this, I think a lot of people think like really young girls. That comes in the late 60s throughout the 70s. That's when we see a lot younger girls reading these magazines. But, girls, women, and men, in their late teens and early 20s were reading them too. Because again, if you wanted to read, you might hide it. You might not want to be seen with teen. That's something I talk about in the book, is the word teen and how it doesn't help in the late 60s to be associated with it. But in the mid 60s, it's fine, because that is what people think of the rock and roll. That's why, there's a whole big conversation around the Monkees. But some really beautiful covers with the Stones. I actually particularly love this TeenSet one.
Beautiful. Look at that.
Yeah.
Very contemplative. Mick in thought.
Yes, exactly. And it's funny, is the article that's included is Judy, the editor, is actually with Mick at a restaurant or a club with another reporter, and Mick doesn't want to talk. So she's like, I'm sitting here and he's not talking. He doesn't want to talk. He feels uncomfortable. I'm just along for the ride, but I'm going to report on it too. So it just goes to show, this is from 68. So from 64 to 68, not a lot of things have changed with the Stones, but we still do get a lot of valuable insight from the magazines. There's a couple of other things I thought I might share with you.
Yes, absolutely.
And going back to the beautiful pink Tiger Beat we looked at, we start to see Mick Jagger become a real sex symbol. They hone in on him. And I love what they say in 65. They say, Mick Jagger is another story. That goes off to what I just said about Brian and Keith. And he's moody and unpredictable. Girls go wild for him when they can't get close enough. But with Mick, it takes merely a shrug of his shoulder to let a girl or anyone else know when he's not interested. Mick's outspoken, serious, and talented. Without Mick's spark and unusual ability to put over a song, the Stones would be in serious trouble. They all know this and accept each other's part in success. So I know some people might think, well, this sounds gossipy. This sounds, not focused on music. There is a lot of focus on music, because it's hard to continue talking about them like this without just describing them, again, because they're not giving the interviews. I don't have this one in front of me, but you can see this beautiful picture of Mick. Very school days. I love that. But there's a questionnaire that's really, really cool. And I will have it linked on my website. Your listeners, guys, feel free to check out what it says. They ask this question. You can choose one long-playing record album to listen to. Which do you prefer? And I think this is really important, is that they establish their musical tastes openly, because the blues are really, really important, soul, jazz, etc. And it comes out in this article. Mick Jagger answers, I want James Brown at the Apollo on the Mercury label. So these answers, I guess I'll read the rest. Brian Jones says, I picked the same LP that Mick chose. It's a knockout. Keith Richards says, I like Chess Records cutting called Chuck Berry on Stage. Charlie Watts, I like any Gil Evans recording, I guess. Roots is best. And Bill Wyman says, just give me VJs, ain't no big thing, just Jimmy Reed. And their choices are really important here, because they aren't the big, super popular teen things at the time, it really shows what they actually are listening to, some things that they actually enjoy, because in general, I don't think these would have been made up, right?
Hmm.
So you can start to see there are really interesting things. And also the very Britishness, the British invasion stuff comes out. They ask about food. Now, I want to be very clear. A lot of people think these magazines only asked about your favorite color and food. That's actually rarer in the magazines than you think. Now, in this case, they did. They did. And but they talk about shepherd's pie, right? So that's very, again, a British food that you see, and what kind of girl that they'd like, etc. But you start to see some interesting things like what TV show, like Dean Martin's Hollywood Palace, or the Evening News, or Johnny Carson's show, Ready, Steady, Go, England's top shindig type show. So they're even mentioning British stuff. So it gives that, swinging London vibe pulling in, because that's huge at the time. So it's bringing the readers into a little bit of a world that they may not know. Because say you're 15 and you're a Beatles fan, a Stones fan, but you haven't explored beyond that, there's a good chance you haven't heard of Chess Records. You may have heard of VJ because the Beatles were on VJ shortly, or Gil Evans, right? So I think that in this way, there are a lot of really valuable things we can learn.
Absolutely. And, I think when you put it in the framework of, again, back then, there were very few avenues to learn about your favorite artists. And now we're
Exactly.
flooded. We're flooded with every
Yes.
detail we could know about the people that we enjoy. We could get at a click of a button or a swipe of a screen. And this was just a form of that.
Yeah, absolutely. People really, really, unless you lived it, and I'm sure many listeners did, even in the 90s, it was hard to get information unless you bought magazines, because I didn't grow up with the internet. I didn't have a cell phone, the internet, and even cable. I did not have cable in my house until I was, maybe 11, maybe later in the 90s. And so it was still, for me, the magazines. If I wanted to read about Hanson and Spice Girls, I would read. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm a proud flag carrying Hanson and Spice Girl fan. Anyways, if I wanted to read about that, that's where I had to turn, and to read accurately as best as I could too, because the internet in the early 2000s still had a lot of fake stuff. So when I did start getting into all the rock and roll stuff in my early teen years, I was still looking at some of those old magazines, the GQs, the uncuts that would be imported. I remember I'd buy all of those, and they come with CDs and stuff, and
Right.
and they just really, it's unthinkable. Just that's where you had to get your information, because the news sources didn't really take them seriously. They wanted to report on the juicy stuff, the getting arrested, or later Altamont, but they weren't getting to know
Details.
the people. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. You want to get to know your stars. Anyone who says it's fluff, oh, it's just little bits of information and gossip. It's like, no, any hardcore fan loves to espouse everything they know, loves to know all those details. And we do. That's why we're here right now, and people are listening. They want to get deeper, and knowing their record choices, because we know the story of meeting, at this station with Chess Records and stuff like that. That's big, right?
Mhm.
That's important. And this is where you find a lot of that is still talked about. Like, we still know those stories are true, or they happened here first. Or that bad boy image, that's here. That is really cultivated here.
Yeah, and that was one of the articles that the pieces I was enjoying was that maybe was it all was it there were two that you sent me. One was the one you just read about the Brian Jones call out, but I see there was another one that was also trying to get underneath the persona a
I
bit.
believe that is in this. This is a prize. If you have this TeenSet, it's the Bob Bonus Beatles on tour with the Beatles. But there's an article in here called "The Mythical Bad Boys."
That's it.
I believe it's in this one. Yeah, the Rolling Stones. I'm sure. I'm pretty sure it's in this one. And it has a interesting picture of Mick Jagger. And yeah, I actually would like to read from that one, because that one is one of the most interesting, because this would be out in 66, right? So this is early on still, as far as I'm concerned, still early on, especially in and where we're going with the talk of like Rolling Stone's still not out until November 67. So we still early on. Okay. But I love this article if you have a chance to read it. It's the Rolling Stones have had their full measure of publicity in recent months in spite of, or perhaps because of, the inability of most fan publications to get through to them in any way. The word was during their recent 2-week stay in LA, no press conferences, just fan magazines would attend anyways. Not true. Their December 65 press conference brought out TV, radio, and newspaper people in addition to the teenage press. And one thing I'd like to say in that note is that we have a lot of women working for the teen magazines going to these. And there have been descriptions. Debbie Gindler, who is well known for her book about her Beatle fandom, she talks about going to some of these, and even like Cousin Brucey and these DJs in New York would just elbow and push, and it was really rough. Okay, so I want to say that is really important to know. It was tough. You watch those videos, it is tough. Okay. No interviews if you want a story, trying to hang around. Maybe you'll get lucky, but better just leave them alone. They're busy recording. Busy they were, but not that busy. It was simply another chapter in modern day myth we call The Stones Are Difficult. Don't risk a put down. But the nature of our business and information, without fresh fruit from the tree of knowledge, we must present old overripe fruit. The Stones must be written about because there are millions who want to read about them. This article, then, is our cop-out. We present an editorial because we could not hang around for a highly improbable interview. Other publications use different methods to write about the Stones. In recent articles in national general interest magazines, pop music was attacked because of salacious and suggestive lyrics. Stones composers Jagger and Richards were inevitably cited for catering to teenagers' basic instincts with such songs as Satisfaction, 19th Nervous Breakdown, etc. These articles only serve to reinforce adult dismay and fear. The Stones' popularity can't really be measured in concert attendance records because many parents refuse to allow their offspring to view the act. And this was the same for the Beatles. This wasn't uncommon. In spite of this handicap, the Stones have induced maddened riots in several sellout gigs across this and other countries. The reason for the duration of this myth is simple and obvious. The Stones themselves have not gone out of their way to dispel the myth, and that is important. They avoid most of the press except the designated mentors Andrew Oldham and Alan Klein. This is one of the first written mentions of Alan Klein in a magazine, which is very important in the Beatles world, especially too. As OK, oddly enough, most of the publications certified as OK are the same publications that have been very adult and very unkind to the Stones. The sort of thing, when pondered upon, as we are apt to do, is at first contradictory and then just confusing. If Oldham, Klein, Stones dislike adverse publicity and rubbish printed about the Stones, and they say that they do, why show interview and press conference partiality to the very people who give out the adverse propaganda? She's calling them out, and I love it. Regardless of how you may rationalize this, the inevitable conclusion is that the Stones and co. want adverse publicity. They seem to be building and nurturing the bad guy image, carefully tended and guarded from any possible sympathetic fan magazines. So what? Indeed, so what? This would be no big deal at all, really, except that an image, especially one which is not part and parcel to the actual group personality, implies dishonesty. They're letting everyone believe that they are what they may not be, bad guys. And there is growing evidence trickling in via letters, conversations, vibrations, and what have you, that the Stones are not bad guys. We don't mean the evidence written in some fan magazines. These magazines say they're good guys without even meeting them. It just seems like a nice thing to say about them. We admit that we have met the Stones, and that's all. Hello, hi, that sort of thing. We can't pretend to let you inside their collective or separate minds. Our only information comes from people who do not know them, and from the hundreds of articles written about the Stones, most of which are useful only because they demonstrate how little they know about the group. Exactly right. The real word, or the At best, the most real word available thus far comes from the fans themselves. Fans who have met the Stones and found them not sullen, not vulgar, not defiant, but gentle, polite, and nice. If we may be so trite, apparently the Stone Guard is not up at all times. Apparently there can be a break in the image, a shedding of the bad guy attitude. The question posed here, to which there is no answer yet, is why the difference? Perhaps it's silly to question a winning combination. The Stones are second only to the Beatles in world popularity. So Mr. Oldham, I love that. So Mr. Oldham must know exactly what he's doing, and we're sure he does. But we are not conceived that these images are key to success. The Stones make fantastic music and give one of the most exciting in-person shows in pop music. Is it really necessary to appeal to the rebelliousness of the youth to remain popular? We doubt it. Good guys have been known to win.
Nice.
Yeah, and this is from a teen magazine in '66, mind you. So anyone, any of the haters on the teen magazines haven't convinced you yet. I mean, right there, not only is that highly analytical and critical, but it calls out the right people too, and that's quite interesting in that case.
Yeah, I think it's been fashionable in the last few years for people to believe that the conversation about, in this case, the Stones persona, has only happened recently. Like only now people have put two and two together, realize, hey, wait a minute, this thing was manufactured. Wait a minute, the Stones weren't really bad guys. Or, this thing was all just an act. And the whole conversation seems like it's only came up in the last few years. When look at this, in 1966, people were already discussing this and dismantling and probing at the image and having conversations about it.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's been around for a long time, and this is one of the first places where people were having those conversations.
Absolutely, and it's majority not only but women writing and young women reading. I also like to point that out because we think of, she likes the Beatles, I like the Stones type thing. And yes, that no one can rival the Beatles in these magazines. Again, maybe the Monkees, but no one can rival the Beatles. But they loved the Stones. They weren't allowed to go to the concerts, like Tiger Beat said. I mean, they were making these comments, and this is something I note in the book, is that a lot of these girls couldn't go to the concerts. I mean, TeenSet reported on, the San Francisco scene first. They were the first to feature the Grateful Dead in magazines. A lot of pictures in that new Grateful Dead Jim Marshall book in TeenSet. First, Judy Sims was a big player in that. Anyway, so we have a couple of different things to consider here that get a little deep. But yeah, it's fascinating that was one of many brilliant articles and this just beautiful issue. If you can get your hands on that one, that one's quite a collector among Beatles fans as well. But yeah, the magazines had a lot to say about them. There's, of course, she points out the limitations here. But even TeenSet will continue on with the Stones. Now, I will say that the Stones start to disappear from the teen magazines in the late mid-'60s into the early 70s, just because the teen magazines themselves are going in a different direction. They are focusing on younger pop stars. When the Monkees hit, the teen fan magazines just change. Will you find Bowie in the magazines in the 70s? Yeah, you will actually. You would never know by the cover of the magazine that you're going to find a glam rock spread of Mark Bolan and David Bowie. But you will, and the Stones will show up. I'm not saying they're not in there at all, but if you look at the Tiger Beat and TeenSet and not TeenSet. TeenSet changes, but a lot of them, not all of them, start to shift in that direction. Specifically, Tiger Beat and 16, they really do shift to a very young audience. Not that they're not important, not that they're not good or interesting, but the conversation around Bobby Sherman is going to be very different around the Stones. TeenSet does keep up with the Stones, so that would be and Teen Screen would include some as well, because Teen Screen and Daybook were real cool too.
Maybe you can speak on how the women in the Stones world were written about and covered in a lot of these publications.
They love to read about the women, especially the Beatles women. You will see articles about Jane Asher, Cynthia Sin, Patty Boyd. Patty Boyd was her own person, so she has all this. Well, the Stones women were also present, less, but they were present. Not specifically the wives already. I think it's because they weren't, Jane Asher and Patty Boyd were quite famous. John was already married to Sin, and she was in pictures. But we do see talks of Anita, but really who we see is Chrissy Shrimpton, because she has her own piece. Tiger Beat does a whole a few mod magazine issues, and she writes, and she's a voice, right? And of course, Marianne Faithfull, because she is, her own self, and she was, and she's musical, and so Marianne Faithfull's in a lot of the magazines as well. So they are focused on, and the fans actually loved this because they all, the Beatles women all had their own fan clubs. Like Cynthia Powell had her own fan club. They had a Louise Harrison fan club, a Jane Asher fan club. They had these fan clubs. I don't know if Linda had one. Probably not, but at least not right then. But they did have their own fan clubs. And you'll see with Chrissy Shrimpton, she had one as well, I believe. I'll have to double check on that. Maybe we don't put that in. Chrissy Shrimpton was well known and written about in the magazines and seen with Mick as well as Marianne Faithfull.
One of the things I think people would be surprised to discover about TeenSet, which you lay out perfectly in the book, is that there were some very iconic contributors to the pages of TeenSet. Some amazing photography graced those pages that people would be surprised to know.
Absolutely. One of the things that really struck me, I showed you guys this cover, right? With the Beatles, the Bob Bonus cover, and there's these incredible covers. Well, he came out with a book, or Larry Marion did. He's just recently passed, the owner of the archives, unfortunately, but he came out with a book, The Lost Photos, right? And I kept looking at this magazine cover thinking, I've seen these photos before. There's no way they're lost. Well, I go to my shelf and I grab the Lost Photos book, and I compare them. And I was like, they're not lost. They're here. They didn't get the credit they needed. But the Rolling Stone Lost Photos book as well. Now, the cover is actually not Bob's. This is March 67. Let me show you, because this one is a little tired. The cover comes off, so I don't mind flipping through it. Let me show you some of the pictures. I actually used one of them in the book. I was given permission, which was so kind of the archives. And I will say this, Bob didn't let anyone use his photos except Judy. So that's really, really important. But you can see some of the photos here.
Very cool. Look at that. Very stylish too. They almost look like fashion pictures. Especially one of Brian with the scarf.
Well, and they get very fashionable because of their women. And that is another thing that I didn't mention there. They had a huge impact. There's always women in the fashion. Let me show you. Oh, this is the photo I used. This beautiful one.
Yeah.
Right here. I loved that photo. But there's these amazing photos of the Stones that are quite intimate that, where else were you going to see these photos? And where else did you? You didn't, because that's why they were listed as lost. Larry told me that actually when artists would ask him to use his photos, he would say no. So I was given permission because he said, well, he let Judy use them. He knew Judy. You're talking about Judy. It's fine. Which I was really appreciative of. But yeah, so those photos are really, really, really incredible, not only for the Beatles, but of course for the Stones here in this case. And they just give this intimate version of the Stones that aren't bad boys. They're looking at, what are they looking at? A dandelion of some kind of flower in that picture? I mean, they're out in the wilderness. Well, not wilderness, but they're out in, a field, and just gives us look at them that, smiling and just sweet, that isn't bad boy. This is the photo you guys might recognize.
Yeah, classic.
Yeah,
it's those in-between moments. And for Stones fans who may not necessarily know all of Bob Bonus's great shots, he also look at that, fantastic. Oh, if people know that Charlie one especially, that's a beautiful shot on the right there. Talk about an in-between moment. But Bob also captured most of the events that happened in all of the Stones' U.S. tours because he was their tour manager during those tours and captured um, those great shots of them out near the pool in Clearwater, Florida, which people know was around the time the legend has it the morning after they wrote Satisfaction. And so those pictures were Bob, and he took some great ones at RCA Studios when the Stones were recording there. So he was very smart to keep his camera with him close because he captured some very intimate, like you say,
He
close
did.
moments.
He did. And the Beatles ones are really incredible too. If you're also a Beatles fan of like Mal and Neil and just just existing. They're absolutely beautiful photos. Yeah.
Another big name that also contributed a lot of great photographs to the magazine, Mr. Jim Marshall.
Mr. Jim Marshall. Yeah. And that's the one I mentioned with the Grateful Dead. Yeah. TeenSet has actually over 250 photos throughout um, 67 and on of Jim Marshall's, and then a few in Ohm, which I didn't actually include that number. I don't know why I didn't include that number in the book. TeenSet changes its name, and there's three final issues under a different name that Jim Marshall is listed as like the house photographer. And this would be before he, of course, went on tour with Life magazine or for Life magazine with the Stones. So a lot of that early rock photography, that portfolio that would have helped him get that amazing opportunity, which I'm sure a lot of you have bought the Stones book. Amelia Davis is amazing. She's the archive runner. Yeah, that they would have been in TeenSet from Dylan with the Tire, Hendrix warming up at Monterey because TeenSet sponsored Jim to be at Monterey, according to Jill Salvin, which is another author that you guys might know. And Ben Fong Torres has spoken super highly of this, and you'll see not only Jim and his photography making TeenSet look so very cool, just so very cool, from Janice to Cream, on the covers, the Donovan cover, just so very cool. But we have a lot of rock writers. I think this is a question you asked me earlier, and I didn't quite hit to it, but we have like Ben Fong Torres will write a little bit towards the end of TeenSet, Tom Nolan, Peter Johnson, John Mendelsohn, and many other of the journalists we think of if you're an avid Rolling Stone reader, especially in the late 60s, early 70s.
Incredible names. It's quite a roster of people who have worked on TeenSet. And to bring it back to Van Dyke's quote earlier, it's a precursor to Rolling Stone magazine. We want to give the props and the flowers to Rolling Stone being like the first of its kind. But there were these hidden heroes in Judy Sims putting things together before everyone else was putting it together.
Absolutely. And I mentioned a lot of male rock writers that came in at the end, but she had really interesting writers. All the teen magazines were typically edited by many females, from Gloria Stavers, which most people would know from 16. Ann Moses, she has a great book on her time with Tiger Beat. She was a young editor for Tiger Beat. And she still works with like Donny Osmond and stuff, and it's pretty cool. And Judy Sims, and she actually had a London correspondent named Carol Tyler. Not Carol Tyler, sorry, Carol Gold. Sorry, my friend Carol Tyler. Carol Gold. And Carol Gold was an American living in London and would report on like the Who before they were doing the Who things live, before Smothers Brothers, and on the Stones and Jeff Beck. And one of the earliest images of Rod Stewart I've ever seen is in the magazine. I have not put that one out there yet. I'm doing it. It's going to happen.
These gems are coming out.
Yeah, these gems are coming out, but all these women did so many. Janie Milstead, and there's a good chance the piece about mythical bad guys I read, it doesn't say who it's by. It's either by Judy or by Janie. Usually when it's not listed, it's by one of the two, because she wrote a lot for, even though she edited Teen Screen for a while, she wrote a lot for TeenSet because they were pals. And I'm sticking with it's Judy who wrote that. I have a lot of evidence showing that it sounds like her, but because it's not as defensive as some of Janie's stuff, but there's a good chance that could be Janie too, or both of them who wrote that piece. So a lot of women were doing really cool things for these magazines and writing about it. You did ask about women. I wanted to add to the conversation that in 1970, they came out, Dell Publications came out with a Rolling Stone one-off. that, it still has advertisements on the back. It definitely was going after Stones fans in 1970, which I think is quite interesting. Um, and they actually have an article on the women and Stones.
Mm-hmm.
And a few of the things, I'm going to pull up some of the stuff that they said that I found really fascinating. I'm sure that you found this fascinating too, is they talk about women, they talk about Brian, of course. Brian had passed at this time, and they talk about Anita. Now, they don't give any really negative things about some of the situation that we've heard and we all probably know of. But they do mention the fact that they say Keith was always less flamboyant than Brian about his women. In a way, he has the strongest sense of privacy of anyone in the group. And I don't know who wrote this. It doesn't list any writers for the magazine, which is not uncommon for these types of magazines, especially the one-shots. They're usually put out as a moneymaker. But they did have some information that you might not have heard anywhere else. And it says, in a way, he's the most strongest sense of privacy of anyone in the group. Publicly, he never seemed wholly committed to any girl until, surprise, Anita Pallenberg, Brian's old girlfriend, came along. And then they actually start talking about like keeping, anchor baby. They don't say that word, but they start saying that like for Anita to keep her, not in Germany, etc. But they do talk about Brian and groupies, dating a groupie, unnamed. They never mentioned Pamela Des Barres with Mick, though. I think the magazines knew better, like don't. Now, Pamela Des Barres would have been talked about in TeenSet because she was a member of the GTOs for Frank Zappa. But often conversations around that kind of stuff wasn't really happening in the teen magazines. But this one I thought was really interesting because of how it frames Anita. It almost sounds, it doesn't sound good, right? And I know there's a lot of conversation around that, but it's interesting who sounds worse, and that's Anita. I just like to point that out. And they also talk about Mick's fans couldn't stand Mick being married. He's had a relationship with Gene Shrimpton's younger sister, Chrissy, and then Marianne. They talk about Marianne's drug addiction, about like her collapse in Australia, and then question all of this stuff. So I think it's really interesting because this magazine clearly isn't just meant for women to read. Because it's like private lives, women, drugs, right? It's very tabloidy in its own way, but it does have a lot of really cool information from Altamont, which gave the Stones a further bad boy look, right? A rhetoric that you see in the writing and rock journalism happens around that time. I call it Altamont rhetoric in my book. But yeah, there's just so much. There's so much more, and I can't wait till it's all packaged neatly and free for everyone to read.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine the archive. The archive to look through would be endless, and it'd be a nice time machine effect of going back to see how people thought, how people spoke, and that bit about Anita and Brian and Keith, unfortunately, I'm not surprised the way that was delivered in a way, and that kind of refers back to what I was saying, where a lot of the times looking through this, you feel this beating around the bush energy. And in that case, maybe they didn't know anything more than what they knew. So there's also that option where they just didn't know the more ugly things that were going on behind the scenes, and that's all they could write. But nevertheless, sure, you just felt that there was more to the story there, and maybe that was the limit. That was the dead end that they had to reach.
Absolutely. And obviously Brian himself already upset the female editors when we read what Janie Milstead wrote, and so it's not surprising that some of this information might not be known, but I also don't think it would have been printed. Again, this one it's nameless in writers. It's not wrong in everything it says. How it's framed, there's some stuff I don't like, but some stuff that I'm like, oh, I'm glad I have this information. This came a little later, and a lot of the one-shots are quicker to publish. They're not like, like the Tiger Beats and TeenSets and stuff. So unless it's Liszt who writes it, it could be someone in their entourage. Like we know that for the Beatles world, Tony Barrow wrote a lot under with or under Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall's name, which are, Beatles roadies. And there was a lot, and it was all accurate. And it had to come directly from them. Because when we look at it now, I was like, oh, I know that fact. That's accepted as a fact in this world. And that came early from there. And so there is actually a lot of information. And I think TeenSet nailed it perfectly in 66, saying that what we're really getting of value is knowing is what we don't know about them and what's really being shaped. And isn't that brilliant that, magazines that are seen as, ephemeral and for girls and full of fluff are really honing in on this conversation, because all of them kind of say that. They're like, we know. Tiger Beat was saying it too. I do want to point out, I can't remember exactly where I had it. I have it highlighted somewhere. The Mick and Keith songwriting duo, that's starting to be talked about. And I think that's one thing that your listeners, listeners might be interested in, is you posted something and I think I responded. I think it's been overshadowed by John and Paul. And a lot of these magazines comment, they're rising like to be the next John and Paul McCartney is Mick and Keith. So it goes back, let's go deep into the whole Brian dismissal, Brian's band of Mick and Keith joining. Well, it's not seen as Brian's band. I do want to be clear about that. It is seen as, the Lennon and McCartney, they are Mick and Keith. And that happens here very quickly. Very quickly. People are noticing it right away.
As I'm hearing this, I'm trying to tie in social media into what these teen fan magazines were trying to accomplish, but it's also a little bit of YouTube in there. There's people commenting and throwing things out there, bringing out topics, connecting dots, and getting people to think about things a little bit differently. And it's just so hard for people to realize that during this period, there really was nothing that was kind of interacting with your fandom in this way, getting you to think about your artists in these different angles. And these teen fan magazines would be writing about these things to kind of push and to kind of get you to think outside the box a lot of the times. And we take it for granted now because it's
absolutely.
We have Reddit, we have YouTube, we have all these places where we can.
You have conventions.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and that's one thing I highlight, not only in the book, but in a free article if anyone's interested on the Beatles and fandom and community. I argue that not only do these magazines have a lot of information, they create a community, because some of them, like TeenSet, you can write in, they publish your piece, and sometimes somebody will write in to what you said, and maybe in a bad way, and it's hilarious to read some of the responses, like, you must be out of your mind if you don't like Ringo or something like that. Anyways, but stones are talked about too in this way. So these young women often, and men, I want to be very clear that men were reading it too. There is evidence that there is a stronger amount of females reading, but it doesn't mean just because they're the ones subscribing and writing that they aren't buying in the stores or they aren't sharing, right? So there are a lot of young men reading these too. But they would write in, so they had that chance to be communal through these letters to the editors, which is really cool. So you could actually write in, do your part. You might get a letter back. You might get published. You might get a response. You might be a pen pal. Like in Teen Screen, they have these fabulous pen pals, or you could be a pen pal. I believe Tiger Beat and 16 have English pen pals. So you can write people in England and get more information on the Stones or maybe on the Beatles, which is super cool in that aspect. So you're becoming very involved in this communal sense. Now, the fan clubs, you could join through magazines as well. Those were ways to get involved. And just reading and sharing. Like you might go over to your best friends and have a reading or take it to school or hold court with what you just read. Did you hear about this? So there is that communal sense that these magazines really bring together that has just been lost in this narrative that Rolling Stone was first and cool, and these magazines were important. It's like, wait, hold on, they are, and they did so much. And I focus on the Beatles, I'm focusing on the Stones, and I have a few more others that I'm focusing on too in their own right, because the narratives, especially of the 60 stars, are really shaped here.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's all meticulously researched and beautifully laid out in your book. Again, the book is called TeenSet, Teen Fan Magazines and Rock Journalism. Don't let the name fool you. It's a must-have in any big music fan's library. Allison, can we tell people where to find more information about you and your works?
Absolutely. I have a website. It's so funny to say. It feels weird to say. It's just AllisonBumsted.com. You can find, any podcast or any work I've done. The book isn't focused on the Stones specifically. There's an article going to come out in the next year. It takes a while in the world to come out. But I will say that it is It's not an overnight read. Some people get it and they're like, oh, and they get through the introduction. But once you get through chapter 3, 4, and 5, you'll be fine. It's a there's just a lot of information in it.
Which is great. I mean,
Which
no
is
details missed.
There's no detail missed, and a lot of cool interviews with readers. Van Dyke Parks is mentioned, Ben Torres is interviewed, John Mendelsohn, and I even quoted Bitmont Trench because from the Heartbreakers, because when I emailed, well, this is a funny story, when I emailed Van Dyke Parks and asked him, because he's in a lot of the early TeenSet stuff, when I emailed him and asked him, would you do just a questionnaire for me? He went to Instagram, posted my email, and said, what do you think I should do? And I was like, okay, thanks at first. But I'm so glad he did, because Bitmont Trench wrote, do it. I loved TeenSet. And so that was my quote from him. And Richie Foray, I've also interviewed from Buffalo Springfield, because they were in there. And the cool thing is, it's a nonprofit press. It's University Press of Mississippi. And the other cool thing is it's all in color inside.
Yeah,
I know. It is so cool, the color. And the Stones picture, and this TeenSet cover is just to die for.
Look at that.
Yeah, but also just ask your local library to get it, and then it's taken care of. If you're interested.
It's a great book, and it's a very important story that needs to be told, and it couldn't have been written better, and no better person to do it. So thank you, Allison. Thank you for being here, Allison. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this. Can't wait to listen to some more episodes.